Welcome to Days at Dogwood Canyon, a nature podcast brought to you by Dogwood Canyon Audubon Center in Cedar Hill, Texas. This is a podcast that will take you into our 200-acre wildlife preserve in the heart of the DFW Metroplex. Take a quick weekly break with us and get outside with the fresh air, the trees, and of course, the birds. My name is Kiersten, and I'm Center Coordinator Community Programs here at Dogwood Canyon Audubon Center. Welcome, listeners, to our Days at Dogwood Canyon podcast. This is a podcast about nature, birds, plants, and us. We will talk about how we all rely on each other to live our best lives. The Endangered Species Act. Many of you have probably heard of it, and many of you may know a lot about it. But I thought we'd talk about what it is, what it has done, and the future of this piece of legislation that just recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. What is the Endangered Species Act? According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife website, quote, "The Endangered Species Act establishes protections for fish, wildlife, and plants that are listed as threatened or endangered, provides for adding species to and removing them from the list of threatened and endangered species, and for preparing and implementing plans for their recovery. It provides for interagency cooperation to avoid take of listed species and for issuing permits for otherwise prohibited activities. It provides for cooperation with states, including authorization of financial assistance, and implements the provisions of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna." End quote. The Endangered Species Act was enacted in December of 1973 by then-President Richard Nixon. If that definition is a bit confusing, let's listen to a different description written by Renee Ebersol in the 2023 Audubon Magazine article, "A Force of Conservation, the Endangered Species Act Faces a Fraught Future." Quote, "The law, the Endangered Species Act, mandates that the government keep a list of the species most in need of protection and empowers federal officials to take bold action to safeguard them. It prohibits harm to listed species, designates critical habitat essential to their conservation, and requires a recovery plan with specific management activities for each species to restore it to a healthy population, and eventually help it off the list." End quote. Gives you two different perspectives of the Endangered Species Act. Since its inception, the Endangered Species Act has prevented the extinction of 99% of the species listed under its protection. The bald eagle, the brown pelican, the humpback whale, and the American alligator, and 50 other species have recovered enough to be taken off the endangered species list. It has set many other plants and animals on the road to recovery. 60 species have been downlisted from endangered to threatened, and millions of acres of grasslands, forests, coasts, and other habitats have been protected. It's been extraordinarily effective at preventing extinctions, says Stuart Pym, a Duke University expert on wildlife extinction and conservation management. In an era when we keep hearing all sorts of bad news about the environment, that's a spectacularly wonderful and exciting statement. End quote. In recent years, and despite its success, the Endangered Species Act has become highly politicized, with certain groups making concerted efforts to weaken it for the sake of economic growth. This trend has taken the focus away from the science behind the act and focused more on the emotions surrounding the potentially protected life forms and the wants of humans. The timber industry, oil and gas industries, and ranching industries have all been embroiled by the politics that now surround this act. But if we remain focused on the science behind listing and delisting plants and animal species that are in peril, there can be a balance that will help us all thrive. Initiatives that help support landowners and businesses that follow recommendations and requirements of the Endangered Species Act do exist. No one wants to take away someone's livelihood or resources that humans need, but we can share these things with other species that need it too. Congress has been in attack mode against the Endangered Species Act since the 1990s, trying to weaken the rulings that have saved some of our most iconic North American animals. If this act is to survive into the future and continue to maintain a support system for those in need, it must be flexible. Let's look back at a few benchmark moments in the life of the Endangered Species Act. The California condor. The situation. California condors once soared over much of the contiguous United States, but habitat loss, eggshell thinning caused by DDT, and lead poisoning took a severe toll. In 1967, the bird was declared endangered under the Endangered Species Preservation Act, the precursor to the Endangered Species Act. Empowered by the ESA, the Fish and Wildlife Service established a recovery program in 1979 to protect remaining condor habitat and to grow the population through a captive breeding program. But the scavengers' numbers continued to dwindle. By 1982, only 22 condors existed, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and partners took the unprecedented, highly controversial step of capturing every wild bird and focusing on captive breeding. The program proved successful. Today, more than 300 of the critically endangered birds live in 5 closely monitored flocks across California, Arizona, Utah, and Baja California, Mexico. And another 200 live in captivity. In recent decades, scientists have employed the same extreme measure for other species, such as the Hawaiian crow, bringing into captivity all individuals when extinction has otherwise been all but assured. The upshot to the California condor and the Endangered Species Act is that drastic measures can turn the tide. Our next species is the Maui nukapu'u. I apologize if I said that incorrectly. This is a bird. The situation? Like many native Hawaiian forest birds, this honey creeper was hit hard by myriad threats and listed as endangered in 1970 under the ESPA. Its habitat shrank as forests were felled to make way for agriculture and urbanization, and feral pigs ran rampant through remaining habitat, tearing up the landscape and dispersing seeds of invasive weeds that outcompeted native plants. The birds themselves suffered from rats, which devoured eggs, nestlings, and adults, and diseases such as avian malaria and avian pox carried by non-native mosquitoes. The government and conservation groups created reserves on public and private land on Maui in the 1980s and 90s to protect remaining forest for endemic flora and fauna, including the honey creeper. Despite such efforts, the bird's numbers continued to plummet, and it was last seen in 1996. In October, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service delisted the Maui nukapu'u and 20 other animals, including 9 birds, due to extinction. For these species, the Endangered Species Act protections came too late. What did we learn from this species of bird? That survival is not guaranteed. Our next species is the snail darter. This small fish, initially found only in the Little Tennessee River watershed, was listed as endangered in 1975 and threatened with extinction by the proposed construction of the Tennessee Valley Authority's Tellico Dam. In the first ESA case to reach the Supreme Court, in 1978, the justices ruled in favor of protecting the fish, with the majority opinion noting that the language of the law made no exception for any habitat modification or destruction that would jeopardize the continued existence of an endangered species. The following year, Congress amended the act to allow exemptions if the project is of regional or national significance. There isn't a reasonable alternative, and the proposed project is clearly better than alternatives. The dam was ultimately built after snail darters were transplanted to other rivers, and the fish recovered and was delisted in 2022. What did we learn from this particular species? The law's authority is immense. But this is an example that might help us move into the future. Our next species is the greater sage grouse. This flamboyant bird relies on sagebrush across 11 western states for food, nesting, and protection from predators. Invasive grasses, agriculture, energy development, and wildfires have shrunk its habitat to nearly half of its historic range. In 2010, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined that the grouse deserved protection under the Endangered Species Act, but it had to wait while the agency addressed higher priorities. In the meantime, private landowners, states, and federal agencies agreed to a sweeping set of land use plans that, by restricting development in some areas and directing efforts to remove invasive plants and restore habitat, reduced threats across 90% of the bird's range. In 2015, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife determined that those collaborative conservation measures were protection enough and that listing the bird wasn't necessary. The Trump administration, however, removed many of the safeguards the stakeholders had agreed to, and the bird's numbers continue to fall. Now, the greater sage grouse is stuck in limbo. Congress has prohibited listing the bird through budget riders, undermining the science-driven law. What did we learn from the greater sage grouse? The threat of listing can spur action. Our next species is Team's buckwheat. Today, it is found only on 10 acres in Esmeralda County, Nevada. This wildflower evolved to grow in boron and lithium-rich soil, cattle grazing, invasive species, and more recently, mining for lithium, a metal necessary for electric vehicles and clean energy technology, threaten its survival. By 2021, scientists concluded that only 15,757 Team's buckwheat plants remained, a decline of nearly 2/3 in just 2 years. Since extending endangered status to the flower in 2023, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has begun removing invasive plants and identifying methods to directly seed or transplant Team's buckwheat to increase its footprint. The government also established a 910-acre critical habitat zone to safeguard the remaining plants, and it banned lithium mining in the protected area while allowing the industry to continue to tap the valuable resource on surrounding lands. What have we learned from the protection of this plant? Well, energy transition adds complexity. And the final species that we're going to look at is the bog buck moth. This striking moth feeds primarily on bog buckbean plants in the low shrub wetlands of central New York and Ontario. Development, invasive plants, and increased flooding associated with climate change are degrading its already limited range. Though the bog buck moth has been a candidate for listing since the 1990s, it took decades for the Fish and Wildlife Service to declare it endangered in 2023. A lack of information about the moth's biology, confusion around its taxonomy, and the long list of species under consideration for listing contributed to delays in the ruling. While the moth will now receive habitat improvements and other support it needs to survive, more than 300 species still await review. Experts say the backlog will persist unless Congress provides U.S. Fish and Wildlife with an infusion of funds to move more quickly, helping species in need before their situations become even more dire. What did the bog buck moth teach us? A backlog can cause dangerous delays. All of these species show that the Endangered Species Act has a range of a success, but isn't it worth it to ensure that everything born on this planet has a chance to live? Moving forward, both sides are going to have to understand that flexibility is going to have to be built into our progress to the future. All the species that we share our country with deserve a chance for success. To learn more about the current status of the Endangered Species Act and discover its rich history, you can access various articles in the show notes.